A neural pathway is a route through which nerve impulses travel within the nervous system. It consists of a series of interconnected neurons that transmit action potentials between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Sensory information is detected by receptors, which is then transmitted to the central nervous system via afferent or sensory neurons. Within the central nervous system, sensory neurons communicate either directly with the motor neuron or via an interneuron, which sends in motor information down an efferent or a motor neuron to an effector. Within a neural pathway, the neurons that ascend or travel upwards towards the brain are termed sensory pathways. Somatic sensory pathways are the neural pathways that relay information from our somatic sensory receptors to the primary somatosensory area of the brain. Within this learning objective, we will discuss the functions of these somatic sensory pathways, the different receptors from which these pathways obtain information, the number of neurons that are involved in each sensory pathway, and then some detail about the specific major somatic sensory pathways that you need to be aware of. So a sensory or an ascending neural pathway transmits sensory information from receptors in the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. This pathway is often referred to as an ascending pathway because it ascends or it travels upward toward the spinal cord and the brain. Once in the central nervous system, this information is processed and interpreted, which leads to the conscious perception of that sensation that's detected by those receptors. So as an example, we step on a piece of Lego and nociceptors or pain receptors in our feet are stimulated. They generate an action potential that moves up towards the brain via a sensory neuron. Unless this stimulus triggers a reflex, which we'll talk about in another lecture recording, the sensory neuron will travel up the leg towards the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, it will synapse, which just means meet with another neuron. Before it decussates or crosses over, it then runs up the spinal cord into the brainstem where it eventually reaches the thalamus. From the thalamus, we have another neuron which projects to our primary somatosensory cortex, and that's where this sensation is perceived. So if we think about the first step or the first structure in a sensory neural pathway, and it's the receptor which detects the stimulus or the sensation. Now, each type of sensation, such as touch, pain, vision, or hearing, is called a sensory modality. And any given sensory neuron carries information for one sensory modality only. For example, sensory neurons which relay nerve impulses for touch will only transmit nerve impulses for touch, not other things like pain or pressure. And likewise, sensory neurons extending from the eyes can only carry nerve impulses for sight and not other senses such as hearing or taste. Now, the different sensory modalities can be grouped into two classes. We have our general senses and our special senses. So our general senses refer to both somatic and visceral senses. Our somatic senses, with the prefix somat referring to the body, includes tactile sensations such as touch, pressure, vibration, itch, and tickle. Thermal sensations such as warmth and cold, as well as pain and proprioception. And proprioception is the body's ability to sense its position, its movement and its actions in space without relying on vision. So it's how you can close your eyes and put your finger on your nose without actually needing to see your nose. Our visceral senses provide information about conditions within internal organs, for example, about the pressure, stretch, or chemical concentration within the blood or the stomach. It also provides information internally about things like hunger and temperature. The special senses are a special class of their own, and they include the sensory modalities of smell, taste, vision, hearing, and equilibrium. And later on in the semester, we will come back to focus on each of these special senses on their own. So the process of sensation begins in a sensory receptor, which can either be a specialised cell or just the dendrite of a sensory neuron. Like a sensory neuron, a sensory receptor responds to only one specific type of stimulus. Now, I just want to point out here, and this is not something that you need to write down, but just be aware of, not all sensations will result in perception. And what I mean by that is sometimes a receptor will be activated, but you won't be consciously aware of it. So this can depend on the part of the brain that receives the neural input relating to that particular stimulus. Or it could be in the case of adaptation, where over time, that sensation is no longer needed to be consciously perceived. So as an example, if you move into a new apartment and it's on a main road, those first few weeks, you're really aware of that constant road noise. After a week or two, you barely notice it. So your brain has decided it is not important for you to be aware of that constant road noise at all times. Now, we have many different types of receptors, and they can be classified based on both their structural and their functional characteristics. Generally, they will fit into one or more categories based on their microscopic structure, the location of the receptors and the origin of the stimuli that activate them, and also the type of stimulus that is detected. So if we start by looking at the microscopic structure, and on a microscopic level, sensory receptors are usually made up of one of the three following structures. So free nerve endings of sensory neurons, encapsulated nerve endings of sensory neurons, or separate cells that then synapse with a sensory neuron. So our free nerve endings are bare dendrites that lack any kind of structural specialization. So they're just the dendrites of a sensory neuron. Receptors for temperature, tickle, itch, pain, and some touch sensations are all free nerve endings. But remember, each of those sensations will have a specific receptor and a specific sensory neuron, even if structurally they're all pretty much exactly the same. We then have our encapsulated nerve endings, and these are the dendrites of a sensory neuron that are enclosed in a connective tissue capsule that has a distinctive microscopic structure. So the different structure or the different types of capsules will enhance or lessen the sensitivity of that particular receptor. And we have encapsulated nerve endings for many of our somatic and visceral sensations, including pressure, vibration, and also some touch sensations. Sensory receptors for the special senses are all specialised separate cells that will synapse or communicate with a sensory neuron, and you can see that down here. These include hair cells for hearing and equilibrium, gustatory receptors in the taste buds, and photoreceptors in the retina of the eye. So you can see here our gustatory or our taste receptor is a separate cell that then synapses with our sensory neuron. Another way to classify sensory receptors is based on the location of the receptor and the origin of the stimuli that activate them. So we can have exteroceptors, which are located either at or near the external surface of the body. They are sensitive to stimuli originating from outside or external to the body, and they provide information about the external environment. So exteroceptor, external environment. Our sensations of hearing, vision, smell, taste, touch, pressure, and pain are all detected by exteroceptors because those stimuli come from the external environment. We can then have interoceptors. These are located in blood vessels, visceral organs, muscles, and in the nervous system. And they monitor conditions of the internal environment. The nerve impulses produced by interoceptors are not usually consciously perceived, so we're not usually aware of them. However, sometimes they can contribute to the perception of visceral pain, such as the pain in the chest that people experience when they're having a heart attack, or any stomach pain when you're having gastrointestinal issues. We then also have our proprioceptors. So these are located in muscles, tendons, joints, and in the inner ear. And they provide information about body position, muscle length and tension, and the position and movement of our joints. Now, two specific proprioceptors that I wanted to mention. These will become important for those of you who are in movement-related degrees. This will also become important for all of us when we start talking about reflexes. And these two specific proprioceptors are called muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. So muscle spindles, which is what we'll focus on this slide, are proprioceptors in skeletal muscle that monitor the change in length of that muscle and participate in a stretch reflex. So by adjusting how vigorously a muscle spindle responds to the stretching of a skeletal muscle, the brain can set an overall level of muscle tone, which is a small degree of contraction that is present even when a muscle is at rest, and is why we can maintain that kind of usual upright position when we're sitting and relaxing, and we're not all floppy and limp. So each muscle spindle consists of several sensory nerve endings that wrap around 3 to 10 specialized muscle fibers called intrafusal muscle fibers. So these in here are our intrafusal muscle fibers. A connective tissue capsule, which you can see in white around here, encloses those sensory nerve endings, making muscle spindles a type of encapsulated nerve ending. Now, the main function of our muscle spindles is to measure muscle length, or how much a muscle is being stretched. And either quite sudden or prolonged stretching of our intrafusal muscle fibers can stimulate this type of receptor. Now, the resulting nerve impulses will propagate to the central nervous system. And in response to the stretching of a muscle, motor neurons of the extrafusal muscle fibers, which are just all these muscle fibers outside of that capsule, will be stimulated. And these will cause the muscle to contract to relieve that stretching. So our muscle spindles monitor change in muscle length. Our Golgi tendon organ, which you can also just call our tendon organs, are located at the junction between a tendon and a muscle. So this red part here is our muscle, this white part is our tendon, which is what connects the muscle to a bone. Now, by initiating a tendon reflex, which we'll cover shortly, tendon organs protect tendons and their associated muscle from damage due to excessive tension or excessive force put through that muscle and tendon. So each tendon organ, which we can see down here, consists of a thin capsule of connective tissue that encloses a few tendon fascicles or bundles of connective fibers, collagen fibers. And penetrating the capsule are one or more sensory nerve endings that kind of entwine or wrap around those collagen fibers. When tension is applied to the muscle, these tendon organs will generate nerve impulses that propagate into the central nervous system. And the resulting tendon reflex will decrease muscle tension by causing this muscle to relax. So our Golgi tendon organ monitors change in muscle tension. Now, a third way to classify sensory receptors is according to the type of stimulus that they detect. So taking a look at some of these examples, and this is not comprehensive, but we first have mechanoreceptors, and they are sensitive to mechanical stimuli. So this could be the stretching or bending of hair cells, like occurs with pressure, stretch, vibration, or sound waves in the ear. We have thermoreceptors, which are sensitive to thermal sensations, so changes in temperature. We have nociceptors, which are our pain receptors, and they respond to harmful or potentially harmful events. And that can relate to either thermal, mechanical, or chemical changes in a tissue. So it could be extreme heat or cold, which is going to do damage to that tissue. It could be excessive pressure, or it could be some kind of inflammatory chemical. We have photoreceptors, which detect light that strikes the retina or the inner layer of the eye. And we have chemoreceptors that detect chemicals in the mouth, the nose, and other bodily fluids like our blood. We also have a specific type of chemoreceptor, which we call an osmoreceptor, which detects the osmotic pressure or the ratio of water to solutes in bodily fluids. Now, if we come back to thinking about our sensory neural pathways, we've talked about the receptors, but then what comes after that? So our somatic sensory pathways, which are just the neural pathways that we are focusing on this learning objective, they relay information from the somatic sensory receptors that we just spoke about to the primary somatosensory cortex in the brain. These pathways to the primary somatosensory cortex consist of thousands of sets of 3 neurons, which we call a first-order neuron, a second-order neuron, and a third-order neuron. So a first-order neuron is simply the first neuron in that pathway, and it conducts nerve impulses from the receptor into the brainstem or the spinal cord. From the face, mouth, teeth, and eyes, these nerve impulses will propagate along cranial nerves into the brainstem. From the neck, trunk, limbs, and posterior part of the head, these nerve impulses propagate along spinal nerves into the spinal cord. Our second-order neurons, which are simply the second neuron in our neural pathway, conduct nerve impulses from the brainstem and the spinal cord to the thalamus. Remembering the thalamus is that central oval-shaped mass of tissue in the brain that acts a bit like a relay station. Axons of second-order neurons will decussate or cross over in the spinal cord or the brainstem before they then ascend to the thalamus. Our third-order neurons conduct impulses from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex on the same side. So our first, second, and third-order neurons in a sensory pathway are simply the first, second, and third neuron in that path. Our first-order neuron will go from the receptor through a spinal or cranial nerve into the brainstem or the spinal cord. Our second-order neuron will decussate, again either in the spinal cord or the brainstem. It will rise up into the thalamus, and our third-order neuron goes from our thalamus out to our primary somatosensory cortex. So moving on now to our major somatosensory pathways, and our somatic sensory nerve impulses reach this part of the brain via 3 general pathways. So these are the 3 specific pathways that I need you to know about. The posterior column medial lemniscus, the anterior lateral or the spinothalamic pathway, and the trigeminothalamic pathway. Now, we also have somatic sensory impulses that don't go to the primary somatosensory area. Instead, they go to the cerebellum. And these sensations or nerve impulses assist with things like posture and balance and the coordination of movement. These nerve impulses go up to the cerebellum via our anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts. And these are sensations that we're usually not consciously aware of. So starting to look at each of those 3 major pathways in more detail, and we'll start with the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. And this pathway is named in relation to the 2 white matter tracts that carry the nerve impulses. So we have the posterior column of the spinal cord, and then the medial lemniscus of the brainstem. So the posterior column is this part here. Remember, it's that white matter on the posterior side or the back of the spinal cord. And this tract is actually made up of two separate tracts, but for the purpose of this unit, we can simply collectively call it the posterior column. The medial lemniscus, which are these two green parts you can see here and here, is actually a continuation of the posterior column as it moves up through the brainstem and then travels up to our thalamus. So the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway transmits nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception from the limbs, trunk, neck, and posterior head to our primary somatosensory cortex. So this is the important part. It transmits sensory information about touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception from our limbs, so our arms and our legs, our trunk, neck, and the back of the head. The first order neurons in this pathway extend from the sensory receptors in the limbs, the trunk, the neck, and the back of the head into the spinal cord, and then they ascend to the medulla oblongata on the same side of the body. The cell bodies of these sensory neurons we find in our posterior root ganglions. Remember, that's the swelling of cell bodies in our posterior root. In the spinal cord, their axons then form, so these axons here will form that posterior column. These neurons then synapse with dendrites of our second order neurons in the medulla, so you can see that synapse occurring here. The axons of the second order neurons will then decussate, so we cross over to the opposite side, and then they form the medial lemniscus in the brainstem, which goes all the way up to the thalamus. In the thalamus, these neurons will synapse with the third order neurons, which then project out to the primary somatosensory cortex on the same side of the body. The next major somatic sensory pathway is our anterolateral, which can also be called our spinothalamic pathway. And similar to the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, this pathway is called the anterolateral or the spinothalamic pathway because these axons enter the white matter on the anterior and the lateral side of the spinal cord, and then they ascend to the thalamus through the spinothalamic tract. Also similar to the posterior column medial lemniscus, the spinothalamic tract is actually made up of two parts. So we have the anterior sections here, and then the lateral sections more on the side. However, again, for the purpose of this unit, we can simply term these the anterolateral or the spinothalamic tract and pathway. So the anterolateral pathway transmits nerve impulses for nociception or pain, temperature, itch, and tickle from the limbs, trunk, neck, and posterior head to the primary somatosensory cortex. So from the same regions as our previous pathway, but now the sensory impulses for pain, temperature, itch, and tickle. Our first order neurons will connect the receptors to the spinal cord, and again, the cell bodies of these neurons we find in that posterior root ganglion. The first order neurons will synapse with the second order neurons in the spinal cord. Again, they will decussate and then pass upwards through our spinothalamic tract all the way up to our thalamus. Our second order neurons synapse with our third order neurons in the thalamus, and again they project out to our primary somatosensory cortex on the same side of the body. The third path that our somatic sensory nerve impulses take to the primary somatosensory cortex is the trigeminothalamic pathway. This pathway is named because the first order neurons that extend from the receptors into the brainstem enter the brainstem via our trigeminal nerve, which is also our cranial nerve 5. The pathway then ascends to the primary somatosensory cortex via our trigeminothalamic tract. So you can see this part here. So the trigeminothalamic pathway carries sensory information related to pain, temperature, itch, and touch. But this time it's from the face, the head, and the oral cavity. So it's kind of like the front part of your face now, or the front part of your head. The first order neurons extend from the sensory receptors into the pons via that cranial nerve 5, or our trigeminal nerve. And again, the cell bodies of these receptors sit in that dorsal root ganglion just outside the brainstem. Some of the first order neurons will synapse with second order neurons in the pons, but others actually travel down and synapse with the second order neuron in the medulla. They all then decussate, so whether it's in the medulla or in the pons, they will decussate across to the other side and then ascend via that trigeminothalamic tract all the way to the thalamus. The third order neurons, as with the rest of our sensory pathways, then extend from the thalamus to our primary somatosensory cortex on the same side. Now, I mentioned that we also have an anterior and a posterior spinocerebellar tract that transmits nerve impulses from proprioceptors in the trunk and the lower limbs to the cerebellum, and that these nerve impulses assist with things like coordinating movement and maintaining posture and balance. Now, we're not going to go into detail about these pathways. I simply want you to be aware that they exist and that these sensations we're typically not consciously aware of.